Imagine waking up every morning knowing there's a 50% chance you won't see your 40th birthday. Imagine a world where taking a bath could literally kill you, where your own home is crawling with rats the size of cats, and where the medicine prescribed by doctors involves drilling holes in your skull or drinking mercury. Welcome to medieval Europe, a 1,000-year nightmare that makes our worst day look like paradise. You've probably seen the movies, the romantic tales of knights and princesses, the glorified castle feasts. But what if I told you that 99% of what you think you know about medieval life is completely wrong? What if I told you that the average medieval peasant worked harder than a modern CO, lived in conditions worse than today's homeless, and faced dangers that would make a horror movie seem tame? Today, we're ripping away the Hollywood fantasy and diving into the brutal, shocking reality of what it truly meant to be alive during the Dark Ages. Trust me, by the end of this video, you'll be thanking every modern convenience you've ever taken for granted. But first, let me ask you this. How long do you think you would survive in medieval times? Keep that number in mind, because what you're about to discover might make you reconsider. The truth is, medieval life was so horrific that historians have debated whether it's ethical to even tell people about it. The suicide rates among medieval historians are significantly higher than other historical fields, simply because studying this period for extended periods can cause severe depression and anxiety. Medieval Europe wasn't just primitive, it was actively hostile to human life. Every single aspect of daily existence was designed, either intentionally or through ignorance, to cause maximum suffering. From the moment you were born until the day you died, which was probably very soon, you were surrounded by death, disease, filth, and hopelessness. The average medieval person would experience more trauma in a single year than most modern people experience in their entire lives. They would witness public executions, watch their children die from preventable diseases, live in constant fear of starvation, and know that their social status was permanently fixed with no hope of improvement. And here's something that will blow your mind. Medieval people knew their lives were terrible. This wasn't a case of ignorance is bliss. They were fully aware that they were suffering, they just believed it was God's will and that complaining would make things worse. Let's dive into this nightmare and discover exactly why medieval times represent the absolute worst period to be alive in human history. Let's start with something simple, taking a shower. You probably did it this morning without thinking twice, right? Well, congratulations, you just did something that could have been a death sentence in medieval times. Here's a fact that will blow your mind. The average medieval person bathed maybe 2 to 3 times per year. Not per month, per year. And I'm being generous with that estimate. But here's the kicker. It wasn't just because they were lazy or didn't care about cleanliness. The medieval church actually taught that bathing was sinful, but because it involved nudity, and nudity led to temptation. Some religious texts of the time stated that to wash the body is to invite the devil in through the pores. Saint Jerome, one of the most influential church fathers, wrote that he who has bathed in Christ has no need of a second bath. This wasn't just spiritual advice, it was taken literally. Clean bodies were considered vanity, a sign that you cared more about earthly pleasures than spiritual purity. Think about that for a second. Imagine not showering for 6 months. Now imagine that everyone around you hasn't showered for 6 months either. The smell alone would knock you unconscious. But wait, it gets worse. Much worse. When medieval people did bathe, they often shared the same bathwater with their entire family. The father went first, then the mother, then the children in order of age. By the time the baby got a turn, the water was so filthy and cold that there's literally a phrase that came from this practice. Don't throw the baby out with the bathwater, because the water was so murky, you might actually lose the baby in it. The bathwater itself was heated in large cauldrons over open fires, which meant it was often contaminated with ash, soot, and whatever insects had fallen into the pot. The soap, if they had any, was made from animal fat and ash, creating a caustic mixture that burned the skin and left permanent scars. And here's something that'll make your skin crawl, literally. Without regular bathing, medieval people were walking ecosystems. The average person hosted dozens of different parasites. Lice were so common that people had special combs made of bone or wood specifically for removing them. These lice combs were family heirlooms, passed down from generation to generation. Fleas were everywhere, in beds, clothes, hair. Medieval people would wake up covered in flea bites, scratching until they bled. The constant itching was so normal that scratching in public wasn't considered rude, it was just part of life. But the real nightmare? Body lice carried typhus, a disease that killed more people in medieval times than war, famine, and plague combined. So when I said bathing could kill you, the opposite was also true. Not bathing definitely would. Medieval people also had no understanding of dental hygiene. Toothbrushes didn't exist. Neither did toothpaste. People cleaned their teeth by chewing on sticks or rubbing them with rough cloth. The wealthy might rinse their mouths with wine or vinegar, but that was considered extreme luxury. By age 20, most medieval people had lost half their teeth. By 30, they were essentially toothless. The constant tooth pain was so normal that people developed a high tolerance for oral agony. Many medieval skulls found by archaeologists show evidence of severe dental abscesses that would have caused excruciating, constant pain. The breath of medieval people was so foul that there are historical accounts of people fainting when spoken to directly. Bad breath wasn't just unpleasant, it was literally toxic. The combination of rotting teeth, infected gums, and whatever foul food they'd eaten created a miasma of decay that surrounded every person. Hair care was equally horrific. Medieval people rarely washed their hair, which became matted, greasy, and infested with parasites. They would sometimes pour oil or animal fat on their hair to try to condition it, which only made the problem worse by attracting more insects and creating a rancid smell. Women were expected to keep their hair covered at all times, partly for modesty but mostly because the sight and smell of unwashed medieval hair was considered offensive to God and man alike. And we haven't even talked about medieval toilets yet. But before we dive into that particular horror show, let me ask you something. What do you think killed more medieval people, war or poor hygiene? The answer might shock you, and we'll reveal it later in this video. Actually, let me give you a hint, it wasn't war. Now let's talk about food. You probably grabbed something from your fridge this morning, maybe checked the expiration date, and ate it without a second thought. In medieval times, every meal was literally a gamble with death. Here's a statistic that will haunt you. Food poisoning killed more medieval children than warfare. Let that sink in. More kids died from eating bad food than from actual battles and sieges. But why was medieval food so dangerous? Let me paint you a picture that'll make you never complain about cafeteria food again. First, there was no refrigeration. None. Food was preserved by salting, smoking, or drying, but these methods only worked for so long. Meat would rot, but people ate it anyway because throwing away food meant starving. They would just add more spices to mask the taste of decay. The preservation methods themselves were often more dangerous than helpful. Salt was expensive and often contaminated with toxic minerals. Smoking exposed food to carcinogenic compounds. Drying often failed completely in humid weather, leading to moldy, toxic food that people ate anyway. Speaking of spices, they weren't used to make food taste better. They were used to hide the fact that the food was literally rotting. The more expensive the spice, the worse the food underneath it. If you were served a heavily spiced meal in medieval times, you were basically being served poison with seasoning. Pepper, the most prized spice, was worth more than gold by weight. But it wasn't because it tasted good, it was because it could mask the flavor of meat that had been rotting for weeks. Wealthy people would pile so much pepper on their food that they couldn't taste anything else, which was exactly the point. But here's where it gets truly terrifying. Medieval people couldn't tell good food from bad. There were no sell-by dates, no food safety regulations, no understanding of bacteria. Moldy bread? That's just extra flavor. Meat crawling with maggots? Pick them off and keep eating. Actually, let me tell you about medieval bread, because it deserves its own horror story. Medieval bread wasn't just made from wheat. When crops failed, which happened regularly, bakers would mix in sawdust, chalk, ash, and even ground bones to bulk up the loaves. People literally ate dirt and called it dinner. But the most terrifying part about medieval bread? Sometimes it was made with ergot-infected rye. Ergot is a fungus that causes hallucinations, convulsions, and death. Entire villages would go insane after eating contaminated bread, leading to mass hysteria and witch trials. The ergot poisoning, known as St. Anthony's fire, would cause people to see demons, feel like their skin was burning, and eventually die in agony as their limbs literally rotted off while they were still alive. Some historians believe that the Salem witch trials were caused by ergot poisoning from contaminated rye bread. And the drinks? Oh, the drinks were even worse. Water was so contaminated that everyone, and I mean everyone, including small children, drank alcohol instead. Not because they wanted to party, but because fermented beverages were the only liquids that wouldn't immediately kill you. But here's the catch: medieval ale and wine were weak, but they still contained alcohol. Imagine an entire society functioning while mildly intoxicated 24/7. Imagine trying to perform surgery, make important decisions, or raise children while constantly under the influence. Medieval children were given small beer, a low-alcohol beverage that was safer than water but still contained enough alcohol to affect developing brains. This constant, low-level intoxication may explain some of the bizarre decisions and irrational behavior documented in medieval history. The water supplies in medieval towns were death traps. Rivers were used simultaneously as water sources, sewage disposal, industrial waste dumps, and garbage disposal. The same river that people drank from downstream was used to dump human waste, animal carcasses, and industrial chemicals upstream. Medieval people understood that some water sources were dangerous, but they had no idea why. They believed that bad air caused disease, so they would avoid water that smelled bad. Unfortunately, many of the most dangerous contaminants were odorless and colorless. Milk was another nightmare. With no pasteurization and no understanding of sanitation, milk was a perfect breeding ground for bacteria. Medieval milk was often sour, lumpy, and filled with visible contaminants. It was also commonly mixed with water to increase volume, which just added more bacteria to the mix. Cheese was safer because the fermentation process killed some bacteria, but medieval cheesemaking was so unsanitary that most cheese was filled with maggots and mold. People ate it anyway, considering the maggots to be extra protein. Meat was preserved in salt, but the salt was often contaminated with lead, arsenic, and other toxic minerals. The containers used to store salted meat were often lead-lined, which leached into the food and caused widespread lead poisoning. Fish was a common food, especially for people living near water, but without proper preservation methods, fish spoiled quickly. Medieval people ate rotting fish regularly, leading to massive outbreaks of food poisoning that killed entire families. The wealthy ate better than peasants, but not by much. Rich medieval people had access to more variety and fresher ingredients, but they also indulged in dangerous delicacies like peacock brains, swan tongues, and other exotic foods that were often toxic or prepared in unsanitary conditions. Medieval feasts were legendary for their excess, but they were also legendary for the number of people who died from food poisoning afterward. It was common for wedding feasts and royal banquets to be followed by mass illness and death. You think food poisoning is bad today? Wait until you hear about medieval medicine. Because when medieval people got sick from their food, which was constantly, the cures were often worse than the disease itself. But first, let me ask you this. What do you think was the most dangerous profession in medieval times? Executioner? The answer will surprise you. Picture this: you have a headache. Today, you might take an aspirin. In medieval times, the doctor would drill a hole in your skull to let the demons out. I'm not joking. This was called trepanation, and it was considered cutting-edge medicine. Here's a statistic that'll make you appreciate modern healthcare. The average medieval surgery had a 90% mortality rate. 90%. You were more likely to survive being struck by lightning than having a medieval doctor operate on you. But why were medieval doctors so deadly? Let me take you inside a medieval medical procedure, and I warn you, this is not for the faint of heart. First, there was no understanding of germs or infection. Medieval surgeons would use the same unwashed tools on multiple patients. They would operate with dirty hands, often while eating. The operating table was whatever surface was available, usually a wooden board covered in blood from previous patients. Medieval surgical instruments were crude and often rusty. Saws were used to amputate limbs, but they were the same saws used to cut wood. Knives used for surgery were often kitchen knives that hadn't been cleaned. Needles for stitching were thick, crude affairs that left gaping wounds. Anesthesia? They had wine and prayer. That's it. Imagine having your leg amputated while fully conscious, held down by assistants, with nothing but alcohol to dull the pain. The shock alone killed many patients before the surgery was even finished. The surgical procedure itself was brutal beyond description. Without proper tools or techniques, medieval surgeons would hack and slash their way through human bodies like butchers preparing meat. Bones were broken with hammers. Organs were removed with bare hands. Bleeding was controlled by cauterizing wounds with red-hot irons. But the real horror was medieval medical theory. Doctors believed that illness was caused by an imbalance of 4 bodily fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. This theory, called humorism, dominated medieval medicine for over 1,000 years. The cure for everything? Bloodletting. Medieval doctors would cut open veins or use leeches to drain bad blood from patients. Feeling weak? You clearly have too much blood, let's drain some out. Have a fever? More bloodletting. Broken bone? Believe it or not, bloodletting. Here's how insane this was. Medieval doctors would drain up to 4 pints of blood from a single patient. For reference, losing 2 pints of blood puts you in shock. 4 pints? That's a death sentence. Medieval medicine literally bled people to death while trying to cure them. The bloodletting tools were horrific. Barber surgeons, yes, the same people who cut hair also performed surgery, used razors, knives, and specialized bleeding bowls. They would make multiple cuts on the patient's arms, legs, and neck, allowing blood to flow freely into containers. Leeches were considered the gentler option. Medieval doctors kept jars full of leeches and would apply dozens of them to patients' bodies. The leeches would gorge themselves on blood until they were bloated and fell off. Then they would be squeezed out and reused on other patients. And the medications? Pure nightmare fuel. Medieval pharmacies sold remedies made from human skulls, ground mummies, and animal dung. Seriously. Mellified man, honey mixed with human flesh, was considered a miracle cure. Medieval medicine cabinets were filled with ingredients that would horrify modern doctors. Unicorn horn powder, which was actually narwhal tusk, sold for more than gold. Bezoar stones, taken from the stomachs of goats, were believed to neutralize poison. Powdered Egyptian mummies were prescribed for everything from headaches to broken bones. Human waste was a common ingredient in medieval medicines. Dried human feces was mixed into ointments for wounds. Urine was used as an antiseptic. Human blood was drunk as a cure for epilepsy. These weren't folk remedies, they were prescribed by licensed physicians. Animal parts were equally popular. Crushed pearls were mixed into medicines for the wealthy. Wolf liver was prescribed for eye problems. Owl brains were eaten to cure headaches. Bear fat was rubbed on bald heads to promote hair growth. The preparation of these medicines was as unsanitary as everything else in medieval life. Ingredients were ground up in dirty mortars, mixed with contaminated water, and stored in unclean containers. The medicines themselves often caused more illness than they cured. Medieval doctors had elaborate theories about how these remedies worked. They believed that diseases were caused by planetary alignments, evil spirits, or God's punishment for sin. The remedies were designed to counteract these supernatural causes rather than address any physical symptoms. But here's the most terrifying part. Medieval doctors were the educated elite. These were the smartest, most learned people of their time. They had studied for years at the best universities available. And they were accidentally murdering their patients with absolute confidence. Medieval medical schools taught astrology alongside anatomy. Students learned to cast horoscopes to diagnose illness. They studied the position of the stars to determine the best time for bloodletting. They memorized ancient texts that were completely wrong about how the human body worked. The human body was considered sacred, so dissection was banned for most of the medieval period. This meant that doctors were operating on living patients without any real understanding of what was inside the human body. They relied on ancient Greek texts that were based on animal dissections and were completely inaccurate. When dissection was finally allowed, it was done publicly as a form of entertainment. Medical students would watch as a professor read from ancient texts while a barber surgeon cut open a corpse. If what they saw didn't match what the book said, they assumed the corpse was abnormal rather than questioning the book. Medieval hospitals were death traps. Patients were packed into large rooms with no privacy or sanitation. The sick, the injured, and the dying were all mixed together. Infectious diseases spread rapidly through these crowded wards. The hospital staff were usually monks or nuns with no medical training. They provided spiritual comfort rather than medical care. They believed that suffering was good for the soul, so they often withheld pain relief even when it was available. Mental illness was treated as demonic possession. Mentally ill patients were chained to walls, beaten, starved, and subjected to exorcisms. The treatment for depression was to be locked in a dark room with no human contact. The treatment for anxiety was bloodletting and purging. Childbirth was particularly dangerous because it was handled entirely by women who were considered incapable of understanding complex medical procedures. Male doctors were not allowed to attend births, even when complications arose that required surgical intervention. Remember when I asked about the most dangerous profession in medieval times? It wasn't knight or executioner. It was patient. Being sick was more dangerous than going to war. And speaking of war, even medieval battles were safer than medieval childbirth. But we'll get to that horror story in just a moment. Because if you thought medieval medicine was terrifying, wait until you hear about what it was like to be a woman in medieval times. The statistics alone will make your blood run cold. Let's talk about something that will fundamentally change how you view medieval times: what it was like to be a woman. And I'm warning you now, this section contains some of the most disturbing facts you'll hear today. Here's a number that should horrify you. In medieval times, 1 in 3 women died in childbirth. 1 in 3. Imagine if every third woman you knew didn't survive having a baby. This wasn't a rare tragedy, it was statistical inevitability. But why was childbirth so deadly? The reasons will make you appreciate modern medicine in ways you never imagined. First, there were no trained doctors for childbirth. Women were attended by midwives who had no medical training whatsoever. These women learned by watching other women, passing down practices that were often more harmful than helpful. Medieval midwives believed that difficult labor was caused by the mother's sins. If a woman was struggling to give birth, the midwife would make her confess her moral failings to release the baby. Women literally died while being forced to admit to imaginary crimes. The birthing process itself was pure medieval horror. There was no understanding of sterile conditions. Midwives would reach inside women with unwashed hands, often introducing deadly infections. The birthing tools were shared between women without cleaning. Medieval midwives used crude instruments that were more like torture devices than medical tools. Forceps didn't exist, so difficult births were handled by pulling the baby out with hooks, tongs, or bare hands. If the baby was stuck, the midwife would sometimes break its bones to make it easier to extract. But here's something that'll make your skin crawl. Medieval people believed that a difficult birth meant the baby was demonic. If labor took too long, they would perform exorcisms on the pregnant woman instead of providing medical help. Women died while priests chanted over them instead of receiving actual care. The mortality rate for babies was even worse than for mothers. Of every 100 babies born in medieval times, 30 to 40 would die before their first birthday. Another 20 to 30 would die before age 5. Families didn't even name their children until they were several years old because death was so likely. Medieval women knew these statistics. They went into pregnancy expecting to die. Many wrote their wills when they discovered they were pregnant. They said goodbye to their older children and prepared their households for their death. And if a woman survived childbirth, her troubles were just beginning. Medieval women were considered property, first of their fathers, then of their husbands. They couldn't own land, make legal decisions, or even leave their homes without permission. Marriage in medieval times wasn't about love, it was a business transaction. Girls as young as 12 were married off to men they had never met. The marriage was consummated immediately, regardless of the girl's physical or emotional readiness. Medieval marriage contracts were literally bills of sale. The bride's father would pay a dowry to the groom's family, essentially paying someone to take his daughter off his hands. The woman had no say in the arrangement and no right to refuse. Once married, a medieval woman became her husband's property in every legal sense. He could beat her, rape her, sell her possessions, and control every aspect of her life. If she tried to leave, she could be legally hunted down and returned to her husband like escaped livestock. But here's the most shocking part. Medieval women were blamed for everything that went wrong. Crop failure? Must be a woman's fault. Disease outbreak? Definitely caused by women. Natural disasters? Women were clearly to blame. This led to something that still gives historians nightmares: the witch trials. Between 1450 and 1750, an estimated 40,000 to 60,000 people were executed for witchcraft. About 80% of them were women. And here's the kicker: most of these women were guilty of nothing more than being old, ugly, or unpopular. The evidence used in witch trials was completely insane. If a woman floated when thrown in water, she was a witch and would be burned. If she drowned, she was innocent but also dead. If she survived torture, it proved she had supernatural help and was therefore a witch. If she died during torture, well, at least they knew she wasn't a witch. Medieval women literally could not win. The torture methods used on accused witches were specifically designed to target female anatomy. The pear of anguish was inserted into the vagina and then expanded until it tore the woman apart from the inside. The breast ripper was used to mutilate women's breasts with red-hot pincers. But even women who weren't accused of witchcraft faced constant violence. Wife-beating was not only legal but encouraged. Medieval law specified that a husband could beat his wife as long as the stick was no thicker than his thumb. That's where the phrase rule of thumb comes from. The daily life of medieval women was backbreaking labor from dawn to dusk. They cooked, cleaned, raised children, tended animals, made clothes, grew food, and served their husbands' every need. They had no days off, no vacations, no breaks. Medieval women had to carry water from wells or rivers, often walking miles each day. They had to grind grain by hand, knead bread, tend cooking fires, and prepare every meal from scratch. They had to make all the family's clothing by hand, from spinning thread to weaving cloth to sewing garments. The average medieval woman was pregnant or nursing for most of her adult life. With no birth control and no understanding of family planning, women would have baby after baby until their bodies gave out or they died in childbirth. Medieval women aged rapidly from the constant physical strain. By age 30, most women looked like they were 60. Their backs were bent from carrying heavy loads. Their hands were gnarled from constant work. Their faces were lined with exhaustion and worry. Education was forbidden for most medieval women. They weren't allowed to learn to read or write. They couldn't study medicine, law, or any other profession. They were expected to remain ignorant and obedient their entire lives. Religious life offered some escape for medieval women, but even nunneries were often terrible places. Nuns were sometimes forced into religious life against their will. They lived in poverty, ate terrible food, and were subject to harsh discipline. Medieval women had no legal recourse for abuse. They couldn't divorce their husbands, no matter how badly they were treated. They couldn't seek help from authorities because the authorities were all men who believed women deserved whatever treatment they received. The few women who tried to assert independence were severely punished. Women who spoke out against their treatment were labeled as scolds and subjected to public humiliation. They were forced to wear metal masks that prevented them from speaking or were dunked in rivers until they nearly drowned. Medieval prostitution was widespread because many women had no other way to survive. But prostitutes were treated as the lowest form of human life. They were forced to wear identifying clothing, banned from churches, and subjected to regular beatings and humiliation. Even wealthy medieval women lived lives of quiet desperation. They had more comfort than peasant women, but they were still property. They were still expected to produce male heirs or be discarded. They still faced death in childbirth and had no control over their own lives. Close your eyes and imagine your dream home. Now open them, because I'm about to describe the reality of medieval housing, and it's going to make you want to hug your apartment. Here's a fact that'll blow your mind. The average medieval peasant home was smaller than your bathroom. We're talking about 12 by 12 feet for an entire family. Parents, children, grandparents, and often farm animals all lived in the same tiny space. But size was the least of their problems. Medieval homes had no foundations. They were basically shacks built directly on the dirt. The floors were made of packed earth mixed with straw, animal dung, and whatever food scraps fell down. Over time, this created a layer of filth that was literally alive with insects, worms, and bacteria. The floor of a medieval home was called earth for a reason. It was literally dirt. But it wasn't clean dirt. It was dirt mixed with years of accumulated garbage, spilled food, animal waste, and human bodily fluids. Walking barefoot in a medieval home meant walking through a biological hazard that would make a modern sewage treatment plant seem clean. The walls? Wattle and daub, basically sticks woven together and covered with mud, animal hair, and feces. Feces. Medieval people mixed animal dung into their wall plaster because it was cheap and available. The smell was permanent and overwhelming. These walls were held together with whatever binding agents were available, usually mud, straw, and animal waste. When it rained, the walls would literally start to dissolve, releasing the accumulated filth and smell into the living space. And these walls had gaps. Huge gaps. Medieval homes were drafty, wet, and impossible to heat. In winter, the indoor temperature was barely warmer than outside. People wore all their clothes to bed and still froze. The gaps in the walls weren't just uncomfortable, they were dangerous. They allowed rain, snow, and wind to enter freely. They also allowed rodents, insects, and sometimes larger animals to come and go as they pleased. But here's where it gets truly disgusting. Medieval homes had no bathrooms. None. People relieved themselves in pots that were kept inside the house, then emptied into the streets. The smell was so overwhelming that medieval people burned herbs constantly just to make their homes bearable. These chamber pots were used by the entire family and were rarely cleaned properly. They were often cracked or broken, leaking waste onto the floor. The waste was dumped out windows or doors, creating piles of human excrement around every dwelling. Some medieval homes had garderobes, basically holes in the floor that dropped waste into a pit below the house. But these pits were never cleaned and would overflow regularly, flooding the house with sewage. And the animals? Oh, the animals. Medieval peasants kept their livestock inside their homes for warmth and security. Imagine sharing your bedroom with pigs, chickens, and goats. The noise, the smell, the disease, it was like living in a barn, except worse because barns are designed for animals. The animals weren't just visitors, they were permanent residents. Pigs would sleep in the same room as the family. Chickens would roost in the rafters, dropping waste on the people below. Goats would eat whatever food they could find, often taking food directly from the family's mouths. Medieval families often shared walls with other families. Sound traveled through the thin walls, so you could hear everything your neighbors did, and I mean everything. Privacy was literally impossible. Arguments, intimate moments, illness, and death were all shared experiences. The lack of privacy extended beyond just sound. Medieval homes had no separate rooms. Entire families lived, slept, cooked, and ate in a single space. Children were conceived, born, and raised in the same room where food was prepared and animals were kept. But the real nightmare? The roofs. Medieval roofs were made of thatch, basically dried grass and straw. This sounds quaint until you realize that thatch roofs were home to millions of insects, including spiders, beetles, and rats. When it rained, the bugs would fall from the ceiling onto the people below. Thatch roofs were also fire hazards. They were dry, flammable, and often caught fire from the open flames used for cooking and heating. When a thatch roof caught fire, the entire house would be engulfed in flames within minutes. The thatch had to be replaced regularly, but most medieval families couldn't afford to do so. Old thatch would rot, creating holes that let in rain and snow. The rotting vegetation would host even more insects and vermin. And speaking of rats, Medieval homes were absolutely infested with them. Rats the size of small cats lived in the walls, floors, and roofs. They ate the food, contaminated the water, and spread disease. Medieval people went to sleep every night knowing that rats were crawling around their beds. These weren't just house mice. Medieval rats were enormous, aggressive, and fearless. They would attack sleeping children and steal food directly from people's hands. They carried fleas that spread plague and other diseases. Medieval homes had no glass windows. Instead, they had shutters made of wood that could be closed to keep out the weather. But closing the shutters also blocked out all light, leaving the interior in complete darkness during the day. Some wealthier homes had windows covered with oiled paper or thin sheets of horn, but these provided little protection from the elements and were easily torn. Most medieval people lived in homes that were either freezing and bright or warm and pitch black. Heating was provided by open fires built directly on the dirt floor. There were no fireplaces or chimneys in most homes. The smoke just filled the room and hopefully found its way out through gaps in the walls or roof. The constant smoke caused respiratory problems and eye damage. The fires were dangerous in multiple ways. They could easily spread to the thatch roof or wooden furniture. Children and animals were regularly burned by getting too close to the flames. The smoke inhalation caused chronic health problems for everyone in the household. Lighting was provided by candles made from animal fat or rushes dipped in grease. These produced a dim, flickering light and filled the air with smoke and the smell of burning fat. Most medieval people lived in near darkness most of the time. Here's the most terrifying part about medieval homes. They were fire traps. With open flames for light and heat, thatch roofs, and wooden construction, medieval houses burned down constantly. Entire neighborhoods would go up in flames from a single candle. And when your house burned down, too bad. There was no insurance, no government assistance, no help from anyone. You just became homeless and probably died. Medieval people lived their entire lives in conditions that we would consider uninhabitable. They slept on straw mattresses filled with bugs, ate at tables covered in filth, and raised their children in environments that were breeding grounds for disease and death. The psychological impact of living in such conditions was devastating. Medieval people had no concept of privacy, cleanliness, or comfort. They accepted filth and suffering as normal parts of life. But if you think medieval homes were bad, wait until you hear about medieval cities. Because when medieval people packed together in urban areas, they created something that can only be described as hell on earth. Medieval cities weren't just dirty, they were biological weapons. Imagine the most disgusting place you've ever seen, multiply it by 1,000, and you're getting close to what a medieval city was like. Here's a statistic that'll make you appreciate urban planning. The death rate in medieval cities was so high that they required a constant stream of people moving in from the countryside just to maintain their population. Cities literally consumed people faster than they could reproduce. But why were medieval cities so deadly? Let me paint you a picture that'll make you never complain about traffic again. First, the streets. Medieval streets weren't paved. They were rivers of mud, animal waste, and human sewage. People threw their toilet waste directly into the streets from their windows. There was actually a legal requirement to shout, "Garde-la," before dumping waste, but people rarely bothered. Walking through a medieval city meant dodging falling excrement from above while wading through ankle-deep filth below. The smell was so overwhelming that wealthy people carried perfumed handkerchiefs just to breathe. Poor people just learned to live with the stench of human waste, rotting food, and death. But the smell was just the beginning of the nightmare. Medieval cities had no garbage collection. None. Food scraps, dead animals, broken pottery, human waste, everything was just thrown into the streets. Over time, these streets built up layers of rotting organic matter that were literally alive with maggots, rats, and disease-carrying insects. The density of medieval cities made everything worse. Buildings were packed so tightly together that sunlight barely reached the streets. These dark, narrow alleyways became breeding grounds for every type of vermin you can imagine. Rats outnumbered humans by an estimated 10-to-1 in most medieval cities. And speaking of death, medieval cities were filled with corpses. Dead animals were left to rot in the streets. Human bodies were piled up during plague outbreaks. The smell of decay was so common that people considered it normal. In London, there were designated dead zones, where bodies were dumped until someone could be bothered to cart them away. But here's something that'll make your skin crawl. Medieval cities had no sewage systems. All the waste, human, animal, industrial, just flowed through the streets and into the water supply. People were literally drinking their own sewage mixed with industrial runoff from blacksmiths, tanners, and butchers. The rivers running through medieval cities were toxic sludge. The Thames in London was so polluted that it was black and bubbling with gas. People still drank from it because they had no choice. Fish died instantly when placed in these waters, yet humans drank from them daily. Industrial waste made everything worse. Leather tanneries used urine and animal brains to process hides, dumping the toxic mixture directly into streets and waterways. Butchers threw blood, guts, and rotten meat wherever was convenient. Blacksmiths filled the air with toxic smoke and dumped slag and chemicals into public spaces. The air quality in medieval cities was so bad that it shortened lifespans by decades. Coal burning, industrial smoke, and the constant stench of decay created a toxic atmosphere that burned lungs and eyes. People developed chronic coughs and respiratory diseases just from breathing the air. And the diseases? Medieval cities were breeding grounds for every nightmare illness you can imagine. Cholera, typhoid, dysentery, tuberculosis, smallpox, measles, they all thrived in the filthy conditions. Disease spread so rapidly in the cramped, unsanitary conditions that epidemics were a regular occurrence, not rare events. But the king of medieval diseases was the Black Death. Between 1347 and 1351, the bubonic plague killed an estimated 75 to 200 million people. That's 30 to 60% of Europe's entire population. Entire cities were wiped off the map. Florence went from 100,000 people to 50,000. Some smaller cities were completely abandoned. Picture this. You wake up with a small bump on your neck. By evening, it's the size of an apple and turning black. You're burning with fever, vomiting blood, and your body is covered in painful boils. Within 3 days, you're dead. That was the Black Death experience for millions of people. The plague spread so rapidly through cities because of the living conditions. Rats carried infected fleas, and both thrived in the filthy urban environment. But medieval people had no idea what caused it. They blamed everything from bad air to angry gods to the alignment of planets. Some people thought it was caused by looking at sick people. Others believed it was punishment for sin. The death toll was so massive that they ran out of places to bury bodies. Mass graves were dug and filled with hundreds of corpses. In London, they created plague pits, enormous holes where bodies were dumped by the cartload. In some cities, they just threw bodies into rivers or left them to rot in the streets. Venice actually developed a system of plague ships, boats loaded with corpses that were sailed out to sea and burned. The smoke from these floating funeral pyres could be seen for miles. Imagine living through that. Imagine watching half the people you know die horrible deaths, not knowing if you'll be next, with no understanding of what's happening or how to stop it. Many people went insane from the trauma. Entire families would be found dead in their homes, with no one left alive to bury them. Some cities lost so many people that they were abandoned entirely. Entire professions disappeared because everyone who knew how to do them was dead. The economic collapse was so severe that it took centuries to recover. But even if you survived the plagues, the diseases, and the toxic environment of medieval cities, you still had to worry about one more thing: crime. Because medieval cities weren't just unhealthy, they were incredibly dangerous. And the medieval justice system? Let's just say that being accused of a crime was often worse than being the victim of one. If you think modern justice is flawed, wait until you hear about medieval law enforcement. Because in medieval times, being accused of a crime was basically a death sentence, whether you were guilty or not. Here's a fact that'll terrify you. In medieval times, there was no such thing as innocent until proven guilty. If you were accused of a crime, you were assumed to be guilty. The question wasn't whether you did it, it was how you were going to die. Medieval trials weren't about finding the truth. They were about determining God's will through trial by ordeal. Let me describe some of these justice methods, And I warn you, they're horrifying. Trial by fire. The accused would have to carry a red-hot iron bar for a certain distance. If their burns healed cleanly within 3 days, they were innocent. If the burns became infected, which they almost always did, they were guilty and would be executed. Sometimes they would force people to walk barefoot over red-hot plowshares or stick their hand into boiling water to retrieve a stone. Trial by water. The accused was tied up and thrown into a river. If they floated, they were guilty because water rejected sinners and would be burned alive. If they sank and drowned, they were innocent. Either way, they died. The church actually blessed these waters before the trial, believing God would reveal the truth through the outcome. Trial by combat. The accused would fight their accuser in single combat. Whoever won was considered to be in the right, because God supposedly helped the innocent. If you were a small woman accused by a large man, well, good luck. Sometimes people could hire champions to fight for them, but only if they could afford it. Trial by ordeal of the cross. Both the accused and accuser would stand with their arms outstretched in the shape of a cross. Whoever lowered their arms first was considered guilty. This could go on for hours, with people collapsing from exhaustion being declared guilty of their crimes. But here's the most insane part. Medieval people genuinely believed these methods worked. They thought God would intervene to save innocent people. When someone died during trial by ordeal, it just proved they were guilty all along. The church officially sanctioned these practices, making them not just legal but holy. Medieval courts had no concept of evidence, witnesses, or legal representation. Accusations were often enough for conviction. If someone said you committed a crime, especially if they were of higher social status, you were probably going to die for it. And what crimes deserved these punishments? Here's where it gets really crazy. In medieval times, you could be executed for stealing food worth more than 12 pence. That's about a loaf of bread. Being out after curfew 3 times was a capital offense. Practicing magic, which included things like herbal medicine or even knowing how to read, could get you burned alive. Criticizing the church or nobility was high treason. Being a vagrant, essentially being homeless, was punishable by death. Adultery was a capital crime, but only if you were a woman. Men could have affairs with minimal consequences, but women caught in adultery faced execution. Even more bizarre crimes included being left-handed, which was considered a mark of the devil, having a cat, which was associated with witchcraft, or wearing the wrong color clothing, as certain colors were reserved for specific social classes. The methods of execution were designed to be as horrifying as possible. Public hangings were entertainment. Families would bring picnics to watch people die. Drawing and quartering involved tying someone to 4 horses and having them run in different directions, literally tearing the person apart. But the most feared punishment was being burned alive. This was reserved for heretics and witches, and it was designed to save the person's soul by purifying their body with fire. People would be burned slowly, starting with small fires at their feet, to give them time to confess and repent. The process could take hours. Other execution methods included being boiled alive in oil or water, having molten lead poured down your throat, being crushed by heavy stones, or being thrown from high towers. Each method was chosen to match the supposed crime and maximize suffering. The wheel was another favorite execution method. Victims would be tied to a large wheel and beaten with clubs until every bone in their body was broken. Then they'd be left to die slowly, sometimes taking days to expire. Medieval prisons weren't designed for rehabilitation, they were torture chambers. Prisoners were kept in underground dungeons without light, ventilation, or sanitation. Many died from disease and starvation before they could be executed. Torture was not only legal but expected. Confessions extracted under torture were considered valid evidence. The rack stretched people until their joints dislocated. The thumbscrew crushed fingers and toes. The Iron Maiden was a coffin lined with spikes that would slowly pierce the victim. Medieval executions weren't just about punishment, they were psychological warfare. The authorities wanted people to be so terrified of the consequences that they wouldn't even think about committing crimes. Executions were public spectacles designed to traumatize witnesses. Bodies of executed criminals were often left hanging in public squares for weeks as warnings. Sometimes they were drawn and quartered, with body parts displayed at different city gates. Heads were stuck on spikes and left to rot as reminders of the consequences of crime. But here's something that'll blow your mind. Despite all these brutal punishments, medieval crime rates were actually higher than today. Because people were so desperate, so hungry, so hopeless, that they were willing to risk horrible deaths just for a chance at survival. The legal system was also completely corrupt. Judges could be bribed, witnesses could be bought, and the wealthy could literally purchase their way out of trouble. The poor, however, had no such options and faced the full brutality of medieval justice. Imagine being so hungry that you'd risk being hanged just to steal a loaf of bread. Imagine living in a world where the justice system was more terrifying than the criminals. This was the reality for millions of medieval people. And that, more than anything else, captures the true horror of medieval life. It wasn't just that life was hard, it was that there was no hope, no escape, no chance for things to get better. Medieval people were trapped in a system designed to keep them suffering, and most of them knew they would die young, poor, and in pain. But before we wrap up this journey through medieval hell, let me share with you the most shocking statistic of all. So, let me ask you again, how long did you think you'd survive in medieval times? Because after everything we've discussed today, I'm betting that number has changed dramatically. Here's the ultimate reality check. If you had been born in medieval times, there's a 50% chance you would have died before your 5th birthday. If you made it to 21, you were considered lucky. If you lived to 40, you were practically ancient. The average lifespan was 30 to 35 years, and those years were filled with constant pain, fear, disease, and suffering. Think about everything you've done today. You woke up in a warm, clean bed. You turned on lights with the flip of a switch. You drank clean water from a tap. You ate food that won't kill you. You took medicine that actually works. You live in a world where justice is imperfect but still based on evidence rather than superstition. Every single one of these things would have been miraculous to a medieval person. The simple act of brushing your teeth this morning? Medieval people lost all their teeth by age 30. The vitamins you might have taken with breakfast? Medieval people died from scurvy, rickets, and malnutrition because they had no understanding of nutrition. The hot shower you enjoyed? That was a luxury reserved for the absolute elite, and even then, it was dangerous. Your smartphone has more computing power than entire medieval kingdoms had intellectual resources. The GPS that guides you to work would have been considered divine intervention. The antibiotics sitting in your medicine cabinet could have saved millions of medieval lives. Even your worst job is paradise compared to medieval labor. Modern workers have weekends, vacation time, safety regulations, and labor laws. Medieval peasants worked every single day from sunrise to sunset, with no breaks, no holidays, and no hope of anything better. They literally worked themselves to death, and everyone accepted this as normal. The next time you complain about your internet being slow, remember that medieval people thought books were magic. The next time you're annoyed by traffic, remember that medieval people rarely traveled more than 10 miles from where they were born. The next time you're frustrated by a long line at the doctor's office, remember that medieval people's medical treatment was literally worse than no treatment at all. Your modern problems, student loans, mortgage payments, job stress, these are luxuries that medieval people couldn't even imagine. They worried about starvation, disease, and violent death. They lived in constant fear that their children would die before reaching adulthood, that their crops would fail, that disease would wipe out their entire community. Here's the most important thing to remember: you are living better than 99.9% of all humans who have ever existed. Your worst day is still infinitely better than the best day of a medieval peasant. Medieval times weren't romantic. They weren't noble. They weren't a simpler, better time. They were a 1,000-year nightmare that we're incredibly lucky to have escaped. The progress we've made as a species is absolutely staggering. We've eliminated diseases that killed millions. We've created systems of justice that, while imperfect, are based on evidence rather than superstition. We've built cities that are centers of culture and learning rather than death traps. So the next time someone talks about the good old days, show them this video. Because there were no good old days, there's only the amazing present we live in today. If this video gave you a new appreciation for modern life, smash that like button. Subscribe for more shocking historical truths. And in the comments, let me know, what modern convenience are you most grateful for after learning about medieval times? Because after today, I guarantee you'll never take your life for granted again. Medieval times didn't just suck, they were humanity's darkest chapter. And we should never, ever forget how far we've come.